I have grown my glutes over 10 inches since the start of my fitness journey, but the majority of that growth didn't occur until I made some major changes to my exercise selection. For years, I avoided some of the most effective exercises for fear of the growth they were going to cause in my quads and my hamstrings, and that growth would overpower the size of my glutes. But when I did finally start including those exercises, yes, I saw leg growth, but I also saw even more growth in my glutes. So these are the 5 exercises that help me grow my glutes over 10 inches.
So number 1 should be fairly obvious, but this list would not be complete without hip thrusts and glute bridges, so naturally I had to include them. These were an exercise that I've included in my programming since the very beginning, but I have improved my technique significantly, and I have definitely increase the weight with which I perform these. Now, I use hip thrusts and glute bridges fairly interchangeably, but I do like using a combination of the two. A glute bridge is when there's a slightly shorter range of motion or you're performing it when the shoulders are on the ground. Both of them are fantastic. However, hip thrust will recruit a little bit more quad because there's an increase in the knee flexion occurring. Next up, of course, we have to include split squats. This particular variation is a rear foot elevated split squat. You'll notice that I am doing a glute bias variation, so I'm really driving the hips back, maximizing the hip hinge, and I'm keeping the shin as vertical as possible. This is going to reduce the amount of quad recruitment and maximize the amount of glute recruitment. Other variations I really love are going to be deficit split squats. I also really like just standard split squats on, like, say, a Smith machine. I do like these more stabilized variations a little bit more for muscle growth over something like a walking lunge or a reverse lunge, but I do think both of those are still absolutely fantastic movements, and they are a very similar movement pattern. I just prefer the static element for making sure that I am putting all of my energy into moving as much weight as possible and increasing the mechanical tension. For a hinging movement, we of course have to include a glute bias RDL. When I say it is a glute bias RDL, you'll notice that the hips are really driving back as much as possible, and we're maximizing knee flexion, not to the point where we're squatting the weight. It is still a hinging motion, but the knees are bending a little bit more than in, say, a stiff leg variation where we're targeting just a little bit more hamstring. Regardless of the variation that you go with, though, you will absolutely be hitting both the glutes and the hamstrings. We can just bias one or the other just slightly more based on the amount of knee flexion occurring. There are also many different ways to perform RDLs. I love them with dumbbells. I love them with barbells. Smith machine RDLs are fantastic. I also love unilateral variations. So your single leg RDLs, your B stance RDLs. I also really like a single leg RDL with your foot, your rear foot elevated, kind of like you would do within a split squat. Regardless, I always recommend having some kind of hinging motion. I personally prefer RDLs over something like a good morning just because of the way that the weight is distributed, but good mornings are also a great alternative if you prefer to have the back loaded instead of the hands. Now, all of the exercises I have listed will recruit all 3 of the glute muscles, but they are a little bit more glute maximus focused. So this is the biggest muscle in your glutes. And I did want to make sure I included something that did specifically target the glute medius and glute minimus. So the first exercise I'm demoing here is a cable abduction, and then here I'm going to switch into a glute medius kickback. These are very similar movements, but the first one is going to be more of a lateral kick, whereas the second one I'm kicking back at about a 45-degree angle. These exercises will absolutely still recruit the glute max, but the abduction element of them helps to bias the glute medius and glute minimus just a little bit more, which is why I recommend having at least one of these variations somewhere in your program to make sure that both of those muscles are being effectively recruited. It should also be noted, though, that the glute medius and minimus are highly responsible for hip stabilization. So anything where the hip is in an unstable position, especially unilateral work like a step up, they will also be very, very active. That being said, those step ups are a fantastic glute exercise. I saved them for last because I think they're honestly one of the best, especially if we are maximizing that hip flexion by really driving the hips back, allowing the shoulders to stay over the knee, and keeping that shin perpendicular to the ground, kind of like how we did with the split squat. Control is really the key to this movement, though, so really control that, lowering that eccentric portion.
Exercise selection is also not the only factor that is going to make a difference when it comes to muscle growth or hypertrophy. I will be getting into all those other factors in the next video, so make sure you like and subscribe so you can see that video going over all of the factors that help me achieve this 10 inches of growth.